but we will be recording. Recording is in progress. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on peace at COP29. It is fantastic to see some familiar faces and some new faces and some new names and not faces for those of you who have your camera off. The way that these recordings usually work is that if you are speaking, you are on camera, but otherwise it is not capturing this sort of mosaic of tiles. But just know that we are recording. Thank you so much to the Environmental Peacebuilding Association for convening this space and bringing us together for this conversation. We're pleased to be here and pleased to see so many of you. My name is Annika Erickson-Pearson. I am the community manager with the Community of Practice on Environment, Climate, Conflict, and Peace. We're a sort of incubation space and conversation holder community of practice, co-hosted by the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. And within our community, we have a working group on peace at COP29. Last year, we had a working group on peace at COP28. The year before, peace at COP27. You get the idea. Each year, well, next year, it'll be peace at COP30. We have a number of folks who work within this space. I personally attended COP28, but not COP29. So I'm really excited to be here today as your moderator and learn a lot about what happened this year. Our goal today is to debrief the peace agenda from COP29 to create space for conversation between three panelists and from all of you. We have, like I said, three speakers joining us, and we opted for a bit more of a sort of fireside chat structure, so to speak. So what I'll do first is introduce the three of them. I then have some questions for them on their participation, on advancements for peace and conflict sensitivity within the COP space, on gaps within the COP space, and then thinking about sort of next steps and looking towards COP30. And then we'll open the floor for you, for your questions, but also for your substantive inputs. I know some of you were there, some of you had colleagues who were there, and so we warmly welcome both your questions and inputs. Because we're being recorded, this is not under Chatham House rule. And once again, for anybody who trickled in late, if you, the way that the recording works is that if you have your camera on while you are speaking, that part will be recorded, but otherwise it won't be recorded. The last thing I'll say is just please do use the chat actively. I'm already seeing a couple things kind of trickling in there. Thank you, Chris, for being the one to introduce yourself. Everyone, be more like Chris. Please just drop a note in the chat to introduce yourself, put in any links. Again, it's up to us to foster these spaces of connection and to meet one another. Without much further ado, I'm going to just quickly introduce our three speakers, and I will also drop a link into the chat for each of them. I'll just introduce them in the order that I have them on my screen, and then we'll get straight into some of the questions that I have for them. So first, I have Celestine Proctor. She is a senior fellow for conflict, environment, and peacebuilding with the Alliance for Peacebuilding, but is a freelance environmental conflict policy and programming analyst. She has expertise in conflict stabilization and peacebuilding settings with a focus on environment and climate change integration into conflict and peacebuilding programming. Then we have Ruth Rhodes Allen. She is the President and Chief Collaboration Officer at CDA, and she's been there since 2019. She has a prolific career working in more than 30 countries, designing and leading programs that build on community resilience in the face of social, political, and environmental systems level challenges. And finally, we have Candida Silva. She is the Policy Associate for Climate and Natural Resources at Search for Common Ground. She's also been really active in our Peace at COP community, contributing to the group's policy paper and advocacy efforts. And previously, she was with Interpeace in Guinea-Bissau. So I will put links to all three of them in the chat. But before I do that, I want to open our first round of my sort of fireside chat, and I'll spotlight each of you as you're going. So Celestine, I'm going to come to you first. I don't know if you've drawn the short straw in that respect, but can you tell us why you decided to go to COP in the first place and sort of what you were hoping for and hoping to do?
Sure. So thanks for the introduction, Annika. It was very succinctly put. I last year I went to COP28 and I found it a fascinating experience. It was my first COP, And I learned so much from a lot of the interactions, especially with local and community-based organizations on the ground that were actively engaged in a lot of the delegations in the pavilions doing open sessions. And I found it a really productive learning space at COP28. And I went under, I was doing my second master's on climate change and development, so I went under my university's umbrella at the time. So when it came to COP29, I was really interested in understanding a little bit more outside of the university, because I had finished, what kind of the wider picture was. I was very focused last year on certain countries and certain aspects based on what I was focused on. And so I had approached ELI to support in terms of getting access and being able to get there. And I had hoped to really understand a bit more about the mainstream process and how conflict was being talked about at a much wider scale than my focus from COP28.
Thanks, Celestine. It's helpful sort of context about how you found your way into the space. And I also find, I agree, I think it's a tremendous space of learning. I found that for myself as well at COP28. I'm going to come to you, Ruth, with the same question. Why did you decide to go to COP29 and sort of what were your hopes going into it?
Thanks, everyone, and just really appreciate the Environmental Peacebuilding Association for encouraging this conversation. I stumbled into COP this year, though having a career at the intersections of all of these issues and love the complexity of these challenges. CDA Collaborative Learning is a research organization and small but very global, and have touched the work of peace building humanitarianism for 30 years, but are virtually unknown in the climate space. And yet one of our flagship projects right now is looking at the environment fragility peace nexus to really say, like, how do we do these things together practically, not just, from a policy aspiration perspective. So last year, our colleague Diana Campos, who I believe is joining us today here, was our COP rep, and she really appreciated the space and the solidarity and the collegiality of the Peace at COP group and the big thinking. And so when both she and our other colleague, Ziad Darwish, were fully occupied with doing the work, this time around, I jumped at the opportunity to be their flexible variable and represent their work. So it was largely a listening time for me, and really to absorb where the conversation is in preparation for COP30 and how we, as the Peace at COP consortium coalition, can be getting our American phrase here, ducks in a row, in order to really make an impact next year and move the needle in a much more significant way than we saw this year. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Ruth. I agree. I think there's a lot of, it takes at least one COP to even understand a bit of what's going on, It's a bit of an overwhelming space. Yeah. So Canada, the same questions for you. How did you end up at COP29 and what were you hoping to do?
Yeah, that's a very relatable remark, by the way. First COP for me as well. So Search is a dedicated peace-building organization, and we've been working on the link between climate and peace for a long time at the programmatic level. But at the advocacy level, it's quite recent. For the past 3 or 4 years, we started having a policy position, let's say, staff member, to try to influence policies both at the European level and at the global level, precisely on this link between climate and peace. And so as part of our advocacy, we've been attending COP27, COP28, and I'm sort of the climate person at Search, so I was the one attending COP29. I was hoping mainly to try and really advocate for our messaging in terms of putting peace in the climate agenda, showing that these are two closely connected issues that require attention at this COP and also beyond, so COP30, etc. Trying to advocate for conflict sensitivity and, of course, for scaling up of climate action in fragile and conflict-affected states. So it was really more of a, let's say, advocacy goals and aspirations. Then we can discuss how well that went. And of course, Search also wanted to network a bit and gain a bit of visibility in terms of our expertise on conflict transformation and how that can be collaboratively used with climate organizations and climate stakeholders. Yeah.
Thanks. It's interesting. I do think that there's an element of sort of learning and advancement at the collective level, but then I'm also hearing for each of the three of you, you also sort of have your own agenda that you're trying to bring forward. And I really appreciate being able to balance both of those. We are certainly not necessarily rewarded for the collective action that we take. And so it's just something that I want to recognize and appreciate. I am now curious. You went to COP29. There was a lot that happened. Can you tell us a little bit about what exactly that was? What advancements did you see for peace and conflict? My next question is going to be sort of where did we fall short? So can you give us a little bit of an update about what did you see? What launched? Was peace mentioned? How do you feel things sort of moved forward for peace or conflict sensitivity within the climate change policy space? And I'm going to start with Celestine. Yeah, right back to you.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Annika. So for those of you that joined the AFP session, I apologize in advance, and I think some of this might be a little bit repetitive of that. So I think that some of the key things that I saw, at least from on a peace perspective, obviously was the Baku Hub and the call on climate action for peace, relief, and recovery. I think that was a very progressive, well, it was a definite step in the right direction, as well as the Baku Hub Initiative when it comes to looking at a lot of the evidence around peace building and climate change and what that might look like and how to transform that into innovation, especially within the climate space. I think that also the other thing that was progressive is the common principles for effective climate finance and action for relief, recovery, and peace. Both those initiatives I felt were quite they really kind of took a proactive approach to engaging people within dialogues as to concrete steps towards peace and recovery and climate change, all bringing those intersections together. I think there was also a COP Truce Appeal, which was hailed as something else that was advocating for peace and climate change and conflict and talking about that space. But I felt like that was less proactive in terms of how it was engaged and how it kind of moved forward. I don't really understand what happens next with that. So whether it was kind of temporary for COP itself or whether it's something that extends beyond, and it's not well documented in terms of what that looks like. So I'll pause there just to ensure that everybody has space to speak on this area.
Yeah, and I've put the link to the presentation that you gave in the chat as well, in case anybody wants to dive in a little bit more. That presentation and that link not only shares that sort of list of, okay, what launched. So the Baku Call, the Baku Hub, these common principles, there was a truce, there were a lot of policy instruments floating around this year, but then also Celestine's sort of analysis on some of the topics as well, which is quite helpful. I'm going to remove the spotlight from you and put Ruth under the spotlight. How did you see peace? What seemed to go well for our issues at COP29 from your point of view?
Absolutely. Yeah. I arrived very early in the morning and in Baku on Peace at COP Day. And so I came in thinking that, not thinking, but sort of fully immersed with the conversations related to the Baku Call and related to the principles. And it was really exciting. And the I guess, anecdote and their statistic that kept getting mentioned multiple times throughout that day that really is stuck with the follow-up and some of the commentary that's happened is that of the 25 most climate-affected contexts around the world, 19 of them are also at risk because of poor governance and conflict. And I think we heard that statistic probably, many, many, many times that day. We didn't hear it on other days. And that was exciting on the first day. And it started to be some light bulb moments like, oh, I've got to be paying attention to this maybe in a different way. Or, I'm a systems thinker on climate, but maybe I also need to be a systems thinker on peace and how those two systems interact. And that to me was progress. I also really appreciated that conflict sensitivity as a term. Like maybe you're a climate finance person. You're definitely not in the business of peace building. Like that just seems very squishy and can't go there. But this whole conflict sensitivity idea that I can be more effective in my finance can go further to new places and to work with different kinds of actors and do the case making for effectiveness. That also seemed to be a conversation that continued past that one day where there was so much focus on peace and conflict. So those were some bright spots for me. And yeah, there's obviously the converse as well, but we'll get to that.
Thank you. Indeed, I think those are the types of anecdotes that are really helpful to hear from those of us who weren't there, right? It's hearing not only how is it framed in the room, but where is it mentioned? Is it repeated? And so it's encouraging to hear that there were some repetitions outside of our sort of choir, right? Outside of the usual suspects. Canada, can I go over to you and maybe even to share a little bit about was climate security mentioned? Was peace mentioned? Where did you hear it? Yeah, it'd be great to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so I was gonna say a bit the same as Ruth. For me, it was surprising. There were a lot of side events focusing on peace, focusing on local access, focusing on thematics that relate to our work. And those events were not only by peace builders or by our community. There was a lot of climate actors also talking about local action, also talking about local access to finance. So it was really at the same time surprising and positive to see the conversation being held. Of course, at the informal level. But at least in these events, we didn't feel it was a complete surprise to have the link made between peace and climate and between these issues. And we kind of had a space to connect with climate and finance actors in these events, both at the official side event rooms or the pavilions. It offered to us opportunities to actually ask questions and maybe even bring a little bit of light bulb moments for stakeholders in different areas. So I found that really positive. And then I don't know how right I am in saying this, but from my understanding, there was at least 6 mentions of fragile and conflict affected states in the draft version of the NCQG, even if it didn't came through in the end. I think it was a record high in terms of mentions in a draft version, which I think it's something to celebrate more or less. And then, as others were saying, the memento at the official level was kept with all that was launched, which I think is also a positive and hopefully a continuation towards Brazil. And then on what you were asking me in terms of mentions, I kind of kept track both at the official level and at the more informal level. So I still have notes to compile on the informal part on a lot of events where people mention either peace or local access, etc. But at the official, let's say, level, there was this World Leaders Summit with every country, not every country, but 81 countries making official speeches by their state representatives. And I counted 15 states mentioning peace and or like consequences of conflict, displacement, somehow the link between conflict and climate. So by my account, that's 18.5% of them, which is not that bad considering the global situation. What I noticed, however, is that these were states from Africa, Asia, and Europe, so no one from the Americas, which is kind of a gap. But yeah, so it was still interesting to see peace being mentioned at the highest level possible, even if then in the negotiations it might not have been the case. So my general feeling is that peace was present at COP, basically. So it's
Maybe
a positive one.
if I can add a follow-up question onto that, it sounds like you say that the mentions of sort of peace or conflict sensitivity or climate security, in that case, were made by states. Do you have, when you sort of, and maybe Ruth and Celestine, feel free to chime in on this, when you look at the lineup of side events and other folks who are engaging this topic, are they peace builders at COP? Are they folks working on climate issues, coming into this issue? Where is the conversation really coming from?
I'd say they're more development actors, actually. So NGOs, INGOs, people who deal with reality on the ground and know that these issues are interconnected and need to be worked together. So they bring up the subject. I don't think it's only peace builders. From what I gathered, because there was really a lot of side events, even beyond the list that we know about peace-related events. There was many events just specifically about local action, for example, and the importance of local communities' engagement, participation, etc., which I think it's really connected to our field of work as well.
Great,
I
thank you.
thought what was
Please.
quite interesting about the dialogues around peace is that there was a lot more finance related people that were talking about this subject, and like the Environmental Defense Fund and the World Bank, and it was all about mobilizing at the local level around fragility and risk. There were quite a few, in fact, very similar themes and similar speakers that did a series around different pavilions around the issues of high risk environments and how do you encourage investment into those environments, particularly from the private sector, which I thought was much more proactive than COP28.
Yeah, I agree with both of those points. And maybe the one I'd add is that I was really impressed with the different African countries that had pavilions, and not just or African regions that were deeply involved in sharing lessons and talking about what was challenging about the things that they're doing to move things forward, and hearing references by different regional groups saying, yeah, what we're trying to do is very much like what the African region is trying to do. And that referencing and that global South leadership was really refreshing for me to hear. And I heard more kind of easily integrated peace building language from a lot of the African civil society and governmental delegations than I did in a lot of other spaces. There were a lot of very siloed conversations where peace building or peace were discussed in their own way, but I was listening for where is the integration, and I heard it a lot more from some of the African groups.
That's fantastic. And it does sound like the issue is sort of growing and building this momentum and that sort of integration. And it's also encouraging to hear that point that Celestine made too, that hearing finance actors talk about this more. I don't remember that quite as much at COP28. So I see that as a promising sign. Now, there's always the risk that we're sort of talking about these public issues these issues publicly without acting on them robustly. But hey, that's how progress is made, sort of one tiny step at a time. Incremental change is certainly not sexy, but it is how things get done. Let's say that. At the risk of adding to the pile of challenges that we are undoubtedly aware of within our field, I do want to ask the three of you where you felt COP29 fell short with regard to peace, to conflict sensitivity, to climate security, where you would have liked to see more action, where you would have liked to see less talking and more action. And we'll just keep going in that same order. So Celestine, I'm going to come to you first.
So it's interesting listening to Ruth and Candida, because I actually felt there was a lot less locally led discussions than there were in COP28. COP28 was huge, and the numbers of local organizations and states that sponsored their own local organizations to go because they had the free space to do it. And they also wanted these people to present at pavilions, was phenomenal, I thought. And I thought there were a lot less African countries represented. And for example, small island developing states, Papua New Guinea didn't go. That was a big one. I thought there were a lot of quite prominent state countries that weren't represented at COP29 and that had been there at COP28, partly because of space that had been allocated. So it was interesting because I was talking to Annika prior to COP, saying, I'm not seeing as many events as COP28. And she was like, no, there are loads. And I was like, and I still feel like I thought the Emirates did a good job of, because they had allocated the space in the way that they did, countries were more encouraged to sponsor their own organizations coming to COP in ways where I don't think that happened at COP29. And so walking around the pavilions, yes, there was a lot of local representation. I'm not saying there wasn't, but I felt that there was much more localized action represented in COP28, and a lot more innovative approaches of community-based action around climate change and peace that had happened, that were being talked about in a much more concrete way. And so when you say, where do we fall short, I think it's the fact that however it was organized this year, that there were local voices represented, but I don't think that we captured that momentum that had been created from COP28 and the action-oriented approach of these local and community-based organizations. That wasn't carried forward to COP29. And I think that that's something that we still need to carry forward, because for me, that made the reality of a lot of the conversations and the negotiations much more realistic as to what was achievable and what wasn't, especially in the climate finance space, which is what I had been focused on last year. And that's why I noticed the difference for this year.
Yeah, and it's a noticeable and essential difference, I would say. Ruth, I'm going to come to you with the same question. Where did we fall short this year?
Yeah, I was just putting a note in the chat, but I'll say it here. It's a really fascinating reflection, Celestine, and as a researcher, it makes me go to the question of, what do we lose when there isn't that continuity? What do we gain when there is that continuity, so that we're not learning anew each time, but we're building on momentum collectively, not just organization to organization or sector to sector. So would love to think about how we raise that voice, but also how we plan. And that, I know, will get us, Annika, into some of the other questions. But I think two additional points maybe. I didn't feel like there was a demand signal as much as there was a supply signal related to peace and conflict. And so that there is, people knew that we were there, but didn't necessarily ask a lot of questions to say, well, what does that mean for me? And how can I get smarter about this so that my work is more effective and impactful? And I would like to see us be bold in inviting that dynamic to change. And we can think of, strategically about what that might be. There are just a lot of platitudes and not a lot of depth. So again, we'll not go further there. Happy to discuss and get other people's perspectives. The other thing that we completely fell short on was talking about actual conflict and violence that is happening to real people in real places right now. On the day, the 15th of November, that was dedicated as a theme for peace, the only governmental representative that I heard, and I'd be happy to be wrong if there were others, but the Norwegian representative said multiple times the word Gaza, the word Ukraine, the word Sudan, and that others talked around the issues and talked around the human suffering at the household level and at the kind of coalface of these issues. So I think we have to be uncomfortable with that we're in a 30-year global high of conflict and really need to be honest, or the credibility as a peace building sector is eroded.
It dovetails perfectly with something that Matthew Parent just put in the chat. He heard many whispers of peace and its importance, notably around the Ukraine Pavilion, and particularly sparked after a side event hosted by the Ukraine Pavilion on the 1000th day of the invasion, sort of really landing that home and rooting the conversation in lived experience of violence. Thanks for that, Ruth. I'm going to come to you with the same question, Candida. Where did we fall short?
So I agree with both Ruth and Celestine. Very nice insights. I thought about two things. So one, of course, while there was all this rumor, all this noise, let's say, about peace at the informal level, the negotiations room didn't seem to hear the noise. So there was no strong or binding language in the final text. There was no significant change in the decisions, let's say. So I mean, there's slight references to vulnerability, references to local action, risk appetites, but very minimal, and no focus on peace or conflict. And so for me, that's a shortcoming. And I think we need to act more in advance with states and negotiators rather than just occupying the informal space. And then the second thing for me, more at the discourse level. So I was following the high-level roundtable for the launch of the Baku call, and there was a lot of mention of the nexus between climate, peace, and security. But all the people, all the state representatives mentioning this nexus, I mean, almost all of them mentioned the word peace, but only two, which was Germany and Egypt, mentioned peace building. And I just, in general, feel like it's easy to say climate, peace, and security together without actually meaning a full understanding of peace or a full commitment to work on these issues. So that's also a shortcoming for me. I think it's still quite a securitized discourse in terms of climate and peace links.
Thanks for that. It is important for us to think about. One thing that we have been trying to reflect on is that necessity for capacity building within the sort of climate action space, within the climate finance space. What do we mean by peace? What do we mean by conflict? What do we mean by peace building? What is conflict sensitivity? I'll put a link in the chat. There was a super helpful resource developed collaboratively by the Peace at COP community on conflict-sensitive climate action in practice that really goes into granular detail about what does this look like, and again, is that sort of nudge towards capacity building. We have one more round of reflections from our three panelists, and I appreciate those of you who've been posting in the chat and putting in your reflections. We're nearing the point where I'm going to call for questions. So prepare yourselves, and also know that I know who's on this call and who was there and who knows what. But for the last round, I'd just love to hear some thoughts about where we're going next. So I'll start with you, Celestine. Where do you see Peace at COP30 going? Does it feel ripe with opportunity? Do we just not know enough to be able to say? What happens now?
Yeah, it's a tough question, in that I think that there's potentially multiple opportunities around more concrete action, but I'm not sure that they're mapped out, and I'm not sure I have a clear understanding of where those initiatives and what they could be and how to do that. I think based on lessons learned, and Annika, obviously we've talked about this, in that, you know, the common principles is a great foundation by which to mobilize people for more. How do principles turn to action, and what does that look like for COP30? But I think based on my own, like what we do on AFP and how we try and generate discussions leading up to a COP, it's like you kind of need to stop the preparation work for COP at least 4 months before. It's like you can't be preparing documents and principles and stuff all the way up to COP, because that 4 months leading up to COP is where you really need to mobilize. It's like anything, like you need to, if you're going to get action and concrete action and really take momentum forward and get the right stakeholders in the room, get more local organizations doing that are signed up to do talks in pavilions, etc. It's you can't leave it till the last month, because I think the Brazil, and obviously I don't know what the size will be, I'm guessing it's somewhere in between COP28 and COP29 size-wise, but I think getting those local organizations represented really early and ensuring that they're able to talk and that they've got space at pavilions, I think that's going to be really important. The other interesting thing for me, I think specifically for COP30, is that, as Candida said, there wasn't a lot of talk around conflict in Latin America and Central America. And that's in part because of how governments frame it. But I also think that, interestingly, there's very limited evidence on the relationship between environmental degradation, climate change, and the increase of organized criminal gangs and gang violence in Central and Latin America, and the Caribbean for that matter. And the lack of evidence around that, and yet there is indicative evidence that there is a tie there. And that's a different type of conflict that isn't talked about, that isn't discussed. And so with Brazil being the host next year, I really feel like this is a space that needs to be elevated specifically for that region, so that they don't feel like they're left out of the conversation. Because at the moment it feels like they're a bit detached and they're like, oh, conflict doesn't really happen here. It's a different type of conflict. We don't really need to know about that, and therefore don't engage as proactively as they should. Yeah, so I'll leave it there and let Ruth and Candida add to that.
And I'll just say, for any of you who are listening in, I already see an agreement from Liliana in the chat. If you have resources or work streams along that, please do kind of bring those into the fold as well. But over to you, Ruth. Where do you see that we are going?
I promise that Celestine and I did not practice this in advance, but it's a perfect sort of segue. I think where we need to be going is not just local actor participation but agenda setting. I think we need to be ready to be led by Indigenous leadership that is so rich and diverse in Brazil itself, in the Latin America region, and then in all of the places that were represented at this and recent COPs. And how do we lead and be proactive as a community, as well as have the humility to be led and listen? And I'd want our community to grapple with that in some of our retrospective about this COP versus other COPs, and just sit with that so that we can plan not aggressively but smart. and how we can, and totally agree about the sequencing. I was so impressed with Rights and Resources as an organization and global network that mobilizes Indigenous and women and youth and just all sorts of different communities. At one of the little side pavilions, they were having a COP at 30 pre-planning meeting between the president of Rights and Resources and about 6 or 8 different youth representatives from Southeast Asia networks. And they were being tactical. Like, they were past the strategy and they were into tactics about how they were going to get ready. How do we listen to what they're doing? I just am deeply inspired by them. The other thing that I would think about is all of the actions, the protest actions that I saw, all had a very negative is the wrong word, very dire, urgent theme to them and tone to them. And we have to listen to that. We have to sit with that. We have to listen about the Gazas and the ways that the petrochemical industry is overtaking the negotiation. We have to listen to that. I also would love to think about climate futures. And I'm really inspired by the work that Dr. Johnson's doing about climate futures, and kind of the question of what if we get it right? And how does that pull us into the future? And what does that mean for environmental peace building? What does that mean for peace at COP? I'd love us to be thinking about how do we have actions as well as publications and side events and trying to get into the negotiation space about those issues, but also really visible actions to bring a positive opportunity to the imagination of this community.
You're reminding me a little bit of the work of Joanna Macy, so maybe I'll put some links to that in the chat as well. Thanks, Ruth, for helping us land on that future thinking note. Candida, can I come to you with the final word before we open it up to the
Yeah, I'm afraid I might be less inspirational. I was just thinking at the more higher level, I think we need to keep advocating for Peace Day at COP, because I don't feel it's guaranteed that it will happen in Brazil. So I think that should still remain in our agendas. And then I see as an avenue in terms of negotiations, let's say, and how to put peace into the negotiations at COP. I see adaptation and the adaptation working program as a really big avenue, notably because there's going to be indicators defined next year. And so we should strive, in my personal opinion, to have an indicator on social cohesion, on peace in the context of the climate adaptation program. And so for that, also just continuing the collaborative work we've been doing at the community level. And again, just as Celestine was saying, we need to act way more in advance, both to engage other constituencies, but also even for our work within the community. From what I've seen in terms of these indicators on adaptation, there's going to be a first draft already in May. And so we're really we cannot wait until September next year to try and do something. So I think, yeah, my main message would be continue the collaboration across organizations and across sectors, and act well in advance. Yeah.
Thank you. To build on that, I put in the chat. If you have missed it, I've been absolutely filling the chat with links in case you are the kind of person who likes links. I've just put a link in the chat to an official Microsoft form from what I think is the Brazilian government, if I'm not mistaken, where you can put in feedback and ideas of what you want them to incorporate for COP30. If there are currently 30 people in this and one person in the waiting room, there are 31 people here. If all 31 of us, plus, I don't know, a good few dozen out of the Peace at COP community, put in a request for a peace day, put in requests for continued recognition of peace from the official presidency agenda, I think that's already a start. It's always nice to come out of these kinds of webinars with one concrete action. So if you do nothing else, maybe do that. We've heard a lot of reflections. We've heard some messages of hope and some progress and some momentum. We have a long list of things we need to do better or things we need to do in the first place. And while I personally hold Celestine, Ruth, and Candida in high esteem and think they're three perfect people to have given inputs, I also recognize that they are not the only folks here with great ideas. And so I want to open up the floor not only to, again, any questions that you might have for the three of them about their experience or their sort of viewpoints from COP29 and moving forward, but also to any ideas or inputs from you. I've seen a comment in the chat from Eloise about making some connections from COP16, and I know you were there in Cali for the biodiversity COP. I've seen some comments from Liliana talking about experiences in Brazil, sort of building on those ideas about what the concept of conflict or violence in Brazil actually is. So I want to invite, I'm not going to put either of you on the spot, but I am warmly inviting anybody who wants to take the stage. And if you absolutely don't want to speak with the recording going on, then just send me a direct message so I know. But the floor is officially open to your comments and your questions. It always takes a little while to get the juices flowing. I'm curious. I'm trying to look down the list and see sort of who else was there. Oh, Eloise, you've turned your camera on. I don't know if that's an indicator that you want to grace us with your voice and some of your reflections from we kind of can get some bonus points and get some reflections from another COP that happened this year. I don't know if you want to say anything, Eloise.
Yeah, just a few words. Thanks for today. It's really interesting. It keeps helping the digestion process and thinking about what next. So I really appreciate that. I'm afraid I'm still full on in digestion mode, so I don't have many very smart things to say. A takeaway from me from COP16 in Cali is one, I think this dimension of perspectives from the LAC region, from the Colombia experience, of course, were very present and also very helpful. So I think looking up to the climate COP30 in Belém, it's yeah, because of the biodiversity climate connections with the peace and conflict angle and the regional perspective, I think there is really some of the digestion should be more joint, I feel. And there are opportunities in NPACs and the CCP community to do that. And the other point for me is I think it's absolutely critical to get some of the organizations that are in their core spaces, so conservation organizations in COP16 and climate-focused organizations in climate COPs to engage, pick up on the agenda and act as champions. It has to come from inside. So as much as we can do on that, I think will make a big difference.
Thanks, Eloise. Indeed, I think those spaces of sort of common digestion across both agendas are so helpful. And also that sort of shared strategic planning. I think one thing I've observed and have been cautious around in my engagement in the COP space, or I should say the climate COP space over the past couple of years, has been making sure that we are really engaging, I say as a sort of peace and conflict sensitivity interested community, engaging in these spaces for really strategic reasons, right? COPs can be a zoo. They are enormous. There are tens of thousands of people. Sometimes you'll host a side event in a pavilion that 3 people will come to. And so it's really making sure that we have a strategic vision as a community of sort of what we want to get out of this. Why the NCQG is the new climate finance goal that Candida mentioned. When we want to have fragile and conflict affected settings mentioned in the NCQG, we need to be really clear about what we hope to achieve. And I think that that joint digestion process helps us to really sort of sharpen that theory of change as a community, with sort of each person coming from a slightly different perspective. I'm curious if there's anything that we sort of missed. I know there were some of you who were there following potentially slightly different related but slightly different issues. So military emissions, we haven't really touched on that very much. Yeah, we missed the humanitarian sector. So I'm curious, folks, if there's anything that we missed, both in terms of either announcements, events, or entire sort of sectors or groups that you saw or want to know more about.
I just wanted to flag one thing that struck me. I spent by accident quite a lot of time with the food security people and listened to a lot of what they were saying. But it was really interesting because a lot of them didn't talk about conflict at all, or peace building, or environmental peace building, or how that affected their space. It was kind of there underlying, but I thought because it was actually quite a prominent issue throughout COP, I found it quite interesting that it was very much siloed off in a way that migration wasn't, and other subject matters weren't. But yeah, the food security sector I thought was quite interesting from that perspective. So there's a potential opportunity there for more coordination and integration into that space.
And something that I've heard could be an interesting bridge kind of into Brazil's priorities as a host. Diana and then Matthew. Diana first.
Thank you, Annika. This is a great conversation. I'm part of CDA Collaborative Learning Project, and I'm program manager for the Environmental Peace and Fragility Nexus. And I just want to share that it's quite interesting to have a COP30 in Brazil. We need to also look at who is governing Brazil. So I think there will be a great emphasis in indigenous people at this COP, related to biodiversity conservation, local capacities around those groups. So I'm wondering if we could kind of host something related to indigenous groups and understanding what is the meaning of peace for them. Because in my experience, working with groups in Peru through this project that I am coordinating, I just learned that in my country, for instance, in Peru, people don't think about peace, and particularly in the Amazon and the Peruvian Amazon, people don't talk about climate change. They talk more about violence and, those militias that they are trying to capture all the forest. So we need to start kind of diversifying our topics and including other groups that also they are affected by violence and environmental degradation, and start kind of hosting events for people who are really at the center of this problem or this issue. So I don't know, we can invite Conservation International from Brazil or from Peru that are working in the Amazon and with indigenous leaders and start building those concepts, what that means peace for you. So I think that would be interesting for us. And I think that would be a good kind of action that we need to take, because I have been hearing in this conversation that we need more action. So that could be a good start.
It's a really concrete one. I think there's this mindfulness about language in two ways. Language in terms of where we're sort of imposing a prism of conflict-sensitive climate action, which might not actually mean anything. They're words that we can talk about sort of at the 30,000-foot level, or even environmental peace building as a concept. So many folks that I know living in communities who are affected by these issues would engage in what I might on a scholarly level think of as environmental peace building, but they're not using that frame. And so how are we narrowing the conversation by over-imposing certain frames or terminology? So it's language in one way, but then also language just really practically. And when we're convening those spaces, how can we, as those either organizations or funders or institutions with access to resources, make sure that we're investing in interpretation and translation? This conversation is hosted in English. Not every conversation within the Environmental Peacebuilding Association is always hosted in English, and often there are opportunities to bring in interpretation. So Carl, it's not a knock on this conversation at all, but it is just to say, how can we be very mindful when we're creating spaces in language sort of on both levels? Matthew, over to you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And I think my points actually align super well with what Diana said and then what Ruth had previously said about creating space and listening to Indigenous peoples. So I'm Matthew. I work as the principal consultant of Earth Resolve Solutions, which is a firm dedicated in supporting highly impacted communities navigate conflict in the context of environmental issues, whether that be climate, water, or otherwise. And I was attending COP29 in support of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus and the facilitative working group for the work that was going on for them on negotiations, and notably with Inuit and Sami. And one thing that I wanted to highlight was a framing that was happening in the hallways anyway among Indigenous peoples was around the war between people and planet, and contextualizing peace as not just an anthropocentric component that needs to be considered, but also finding peace with the planet. So that was a framing that I thought was gaining momentum anyway. And then a lot of the colleagues that I was working with were also following just transition. And while it wasn't specifically noted in the context of peace or environmental peace building, I do think that there's something worth building on around how just transition can be a topic for facilitating conversations around peace and reducing conflict, notably in the context of extractive industries. And Brazil certainly is a fantastic context for that continued conversation. So anyway, I'm still digesting, much like Eloise, so not much more to add, but those are some observations that connect to what we've been talking about.
Thanks, Matthew. I will definitely be sending you a follow-up email. That will be my action item coming out of this conversation. It's interesting that you touch on the different, again, sort of this prism of an anthropocentric peace versus peace with planet, and sort of expanding that definition. One thing that I've noticed is often that the different sort of fields will come at this topic from very different angles. Ruth mentioned earlier the humanitarian sector, and I've noticed that the humanitarian and development sides often come much more from arguing for the expansion of climate finance and action into fragile and conflict affected areas. And so even within our sort of general folks interested in peace and conflict sensitivity issues space, everybody is kind of coming in from a different angle. And I think that unpacking what peace actually means is certainly an underserved angle that I would look forward to hearing more about in the run-up to COP30. Carl.
Thank you. Great discussion. I'm wondering, kind of somewhat two related questions, but about the process. What do we learn going from COP28 to COP29? Both in terms of keeping peace on the agenda and then diving in a little more, making it a little more concrete, a little more specific, and then kind of learning from that process from COP28 to COP29. What does that mean for strategy from COP29 to COP30?
I was going to say those are $2 million questions. So if any of our three speakers would like to start for $2 million, Celestine, I'll maybe come to you first because I saw you unmute.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I don't know how the back end of COP works. I feel like there's an entry point with government ministries of the host government, and Liliana has mentioned, the Ministry of Indigenous People in Brazil. I feel like there needs to be for there to be strong action-oriented momentum within the COP itself. I think that it needs to come from the host government, or at least it feels like that or the presidency along with the host government, that there is lobbying that can be done much more effectively, probably by the host government than into the presidency than outsiders. And so having someone on the inside within ministries that feel that this is important in Brazil, that you can kind of rally to this cause, where you have a kind of concrete plan of action that you've worked alongside them, and then that can be lobbied into the COP presidency. That might be a more effective way of doing it, with momentum behind it and host government. But it's going to take coordination to do that. And I don't have a clear picture in my head of what that looks like, but I wonder whether Brazil actually might be a good opportunity to do that because of because they hold a lot of the cards when it comes to climate change, right? So it's it could be a way of capitalizing on that, I think.
Candida or Ruth, either of you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think Celestine has the right approach there. I also wonder if there's a focusing, like what is instead of trying to be broad, what are the specific interrelated 3 or 4 sub-issues that we really want to move forward? Is it land governance? Is it water? Is it corruption? Have all been mentioned on this call. Thinking about not just interstate violence, or interstate conflict, but violence at a much more subnational level, like thinking about scale and scope. I'm a geographer, sorry, but thinking about those kind of sort of ways of giving us some focus would help with the messaging and help us in the preparation.
I think that's right. I think it's really about sort of honing in. There's a great point in the chat from Ellie, recognizing adaptation is a key area where we can make these connections, but mitigation is also vital. The presidency acknowledged conflicts increase global emissions, which was a helpful acknowledgement, but without any sort of proposed action. So I think that's also sort of one of those angles where we can narrow in and zero in. I may take my sort of moderator privilege to add my 2 cents if I'm allowed, which is to say COP28 had a much more sort of structured feel around these issues. But we can't forget that at COP27, the Egyptian presidency brought peace forward and created an entire initiative kind of coming out of COP27 that UNDP has been working extensively with. It's called CRISP, Climate Responses for Sustaining Peace. And it's a climate peace and security project based on the African subcontinent, or on the African continent. And so we can't forget that it has had its legacy sort of building over time. COP28 felt so consolidated, partially in from my view, just based on how much the UAE government was able to invest in the staffing for the entire year running up to COP28. I think one of the reasons we had such a robust declaration was because of of that sort of investment in time and space into that sort of negotiation. And I'm sorry if my my whole computer seems to be freezing a little bit, so I apologize if I'm okay. Great. I think that sort of investment really supported it, but there was also, running into COP29, there just wasn't a sort of uniform. There was much less uniformity across the governments who were supporting the COP29 presidency. So the governments were much better organized. The investment of time not only helped civil society figure out how to engage with the declaration, but the different government positions, they spent an intense amount of time negotiating. And so the governments were really sort of in a line, and that's how we got that declaration. I think for COP29, it was really all over the place. They were sort of coming in and out. And so I think using the levers that different actors on this call and within the community have to continue to accompany different negotiating stakeholders and conferences to the parties to the conference will be very helpful in trying to kind of, as Ruth said earlier, get everyone's ducks in a row. Any other thoughts? Anyone else who has some thoughts about kind of moving from COP28 to 29 and 29 to 30? Yeah, Ruth.
My hand raised button isn't obvious, but it's interesting how this was framed as the climate finance COP, and yet we've talked very little about climate finance on this call, and how we bridge from the very disappointing negotiated agreements to not slide backwards, but also think about how those resources that are committed can be used in the smartest way possible for the issues that we're talking about. And I don't have any of the answers on that, but I think one conversation kind of has stayed in my mind with someone from the Asia Development Bank at COP this year, where climate finance guy, and he knew a lot about the work across the region, but it was a new conversation. This isn't on him. It's other parts of his organization are very attuned to climate sensitivity, but it was a new conversation for him. And so how do we bridge from the theme of this COP into the theme of the next COP without losing momentum on the money?
Absolutely. And how do we continue to build bridges for folks from our sector to come in and understand all of the complexity that is the COP space and climate finance? I suppose maybe one more question that I have for all three of our panelists is if you can just speak to why you see this collective action as supporting the agenda. Like I said at the beginning, each of you went to COP for your own reasons, each of your institutions, organizations, sort of the different hats that you wear, you had something that you were hoping to achieve. And each of you named a part of connection and collaborative action with others as one of the reasons you were there, whether it be learning, whether it be sort of joint advocacy, et cetera. I'm curious what you see as the value add of collaborative action in this space and on this topic. And I'm hoping that this will sort of direct our conversation towards a landing point and maybe on that energized sense of how we can move forward together. Celestine, can I start with you? I did not give them this question in advance, everyone, so putting them on the spot.
So to summarize your question, it's why do I think collaboration might be important in this space?
Exactly.
I mean, I've been a conflict advisor for many years, and I think moving into this nexus space, without collaboration, how far can you get? That's kind of the bottom line. It's like it's kind of like you're working with only one part of your toolbox, and you don't have the rest of the tools to make it work. And so and the COPs progressively have got more voices and more diversity in those voices, with financial representatives, INGOs, local community-based organizations, state governments, private sector, etc. But we're also working in silos. So it's great that we're all there and we're all having these conversations. But I think without more collaboration, we're not going to move the needle at all. Is kind of the bottom line.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We might hold these individual sets of expertise, but it's not actually going to nudge anything forward until we get together and talk about it. Ruth, can I come to you with the same question?
So CDA stands for Collaborative Development Action, but our actual legal name is CDA Collaborative Learning Projects. So we have collaboration twice in our official name. So we're all in on the idea of collaboration. And, as a very small research-focused organization, our impact is what everybody else does in policy spaces, in academic spaces, in programming, in donor spaces. And so, we are, as conflict and peace building, as a conflict and peace building community, we're natural systems thinkers, and so we have a muscle that's strengthened that a lot of others don't, and that's a superpower for this set of people to say, how do we collaborate effectively? How do we collaborate with shared vision? How do we collaborate with urgency? And that, to me, is not something that individual climate advisors or presidents of organizations or peace building leads within organizations can do separately. We have to be convened. We have to have the resources to build that connective tissue so we don't lose the momentum and we can be creative together and we don't have to infight for resources and things. I think that's honestly the biggest thing holding back collaboration, is that the resources to work together as a movement, and would love to see that conversation happen as part of the climate finance conversations, as part of the adaptation and mitigation conversations as well. But I don't know, that's an in part answer to your question. I think we can't not collaborate.
Absolutely. And I appreciate your point about the sort of resourcing and movement orientation, which is such an essential part of the equation. And I think with every passing year, we seem to be getting a little bit closer. Candida, can I come to you with the same question for this last round?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. It seems obvious. I don't think there's any other way to move forward. We have a lot to learn from each other as well, in terms of language, in terms of different needs, possible scopes of action. And it really is a cliche, but we are stronger and more impactful together. As Ruth and Celestine were saying, we don't have all the resources, all the tools, so we really need to work together if we want to move forward. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, I want to thank our three speakers. We are going to, I'm going to kind of close this down, but we are going to stay on the line. We're going to stop the recording and have a Chatham House rule off the record conversation to debrief, because I know there are some points of this and I'm getting some notes in the chat that there's some other pieces to talk about. So anyone watching the recording, you did miss out on a little 15-minute conversation. But I want to thank our three speakers and contributors, Ruth, Candida, and Celestine. I also just want to express my appreciation to Harriet McHale-Hill and Thomas Reeve from International Alert and Oxfam, respectively, for their leadership of the Peace at COP29 group. They did a fantastic job bringing this collaborative group together, in leading the development of a policy paper, in really leading sort of some of that on-site coordination and information sharing. It was a full year-long effort, and we just really appreciate their efforts. For any of you who are interested in continuing the conversation, I'm going to put a link to, or I'm going to put my email in the chat. As I said, as of sort of next week, Peace at COP29 will become Peace at COP30. The working group continues under its new title. And we welcome all types. There's no formal membership. You can jump in, jump out, follow from afar, whatever you want. But we'd love to have you along for the ride. So I'll put my email address in the chat, and that's just how you sign up. So thank you officially. And Carl, would you mind stopping the recording?